With the Dragon Age The Veilguard gameplay reveal, as well as the marketing and slow drip of information that Bioware has been feeding us, I have to say that the fans or the community of Bioware has probably never been as divided as it is now. And I use the term community very loosely because it's anything but communal. Now, you might argue that the fans were divided back in 2012 with the Mass Effect 3 ending, and that is technically true. But the division that exists now is a different one, and it's much more fundamental and essential in the sense that what divides the quote-unquote community of Bioware is what they want and what they expect from a game. That really wasn't necessarily the case in 2012. Or if it was, nobody was particularly vocal about it at the time. And I think the marketing of Dragon Age The Veilguard has been very indicative of this division. Fundamentally, you have basically two groups of people that want very, very different things from a Dragon Age or Bioware game. On the one hand, you have the group of people who essentially look at Bioware games as an extension of romance or dating sims. They're primarily interested in the characters, the relationships, particularly the romances that exist between the characters in the game. The story may or may not be important to them, and generally speaking, they really like to self-insert. They see themselves in the character, and combat and game mechanics are completely irrelevant to them. On the other hand, you have people who very much enjoy and appreciate in-depth combat and gameplay mechanics, and also assign quite a bit of importance to the story, meaning they appreciate gameplay and the overarching story. The characters are important, but they're there to fit into the backdrop of the greater story as opposed to being the source of the story themselves. And of course, you get many different iterations of gaming demographics in between that. There are people who love the romances, love the character relationships, love the story, love the combat, love all of that. But certainly based on my observations, the groups that I cited, the ones that primarily value the game based on things such as romance and relationships and character interactions, and those who care mostly about combat and overarching story, seem to be the biggest sources of the division. And not too surprisingly, I fall into the latter. I care mostly about the overarching story and the combat. And this speaks to a greater principle of any sort of fiction or fantasy story that you're going to tell. For me, the characters in a story fall, as I said, into the backdrop of the story itself. They help make the story, they help tell the story, but they're not meant to be the source of the story. As in, they're not necessarily the driving force behind the world itself. They are part of the world, and therefore they are subordinate to the world. They might make an impact on the world. They might contribute something very important, but ultimately they too are subject to the whims and forces of that fictional setting as much as anybody else is. And you see this structuring of story in many different types of fictional settings. Be it Lord of the Rings, where the characters are important, but they're not more important than the world and the setting itself, or something as different as the Dune setting that I'm not necessarily a huge fan of, but all the characters are part of the hierarchy and structure of the world itself. Aragorn and Paul Atreides, for example, are not more important than the setting that they inhabit. The other side of the fence, of course, is quite different, and I happen not to belong to that faction, and so it's a little bit more difficult for me to understand what's going on there. But I have done some research, and I've talked to people who are familiar with the subject. And this is a type of fantasy or fictional storytelling that primarily revolves around characters. The world itself is either much less significant or is subordinate to the characters themselves. It doesn't play as an important role. The characters are not playing roles within the world. The world is simply a backdrop for the characters. This sort of storytelling mechanic is best exemplified, I think, in fan fiction, and indeed, many of the people who either write fan fiction or enjoy fan fiction are the type of people who enjoy Dragon Age, Mass Effect, and various fantasy RPGs in the sense of romance sims and primarily character-driven stories where the lore and certainly the combat play a very, very distant role, if any. Case in point, I've conversed with people that are big fans of Dragon Age, and one of them quite literally told me the reason why they play Dragon Age is so they can self-insert and have cute, pretty characters that they can dress up like dolls and have romances with. And I'm mentioning all of this because I really think this is the ultimate source of the division. And the problem is, in the part of Bioware, because Bioware is in a fervor of marketing right now, a slow drip of information, but nonetheless a consistent one, all in the hopes that Dragon Age will sell very well, and therein lies the problem. It's very difficult to cultivate an audience whose interest in the game is divided into 2, 3, 4 different factions. In this case, it's primarily 2, and it seems to me that at this current moment in time, based on the marketing, Bioware is going full in on the romance sim characters are most important, story and combat are less important role. The things that they talk about, for the most part, are the characters and how important they are, and how they're essential to the story. They've gone on and on about nudity and genitals and romances that you can have, and how important that is. The character creator, something I appreciate, which I suspect will be the best aspect of Dragon Age the Veilguard, is something they've talked about quite a lot, with its ability to produce all kinds of characters of great variety and depth. But when they talk about the combat, it's pretty minimal. They've mentioned things here and there. One of the things that one of the developers mentioned was that the combat actually does feel kind of weighty when you're swinging a weapon, but that was a very brief snippet. And from the hack and slashy action type of combat we've seen in the gameplay reveal, I'm just not convinced that combat is an important aspect of this game, which is fine depending on where you're coming from. The story aspect is a little bit trickier because I think there are people who play Dragon Age and Bioware games primarily as romance dating sims, but nonetheless find the story interesting in as much as it connects to the characters they appreciate. Various people who romance Solus and are somewhat obsessed with him, they might find the story of the elves, Solus, and the Evanuris quite compelling for that one reason, for example. And because the story is the thing we quite literally know the least about, they've revealed a lot about the characters, and we've seen what the combat looks like, it's very difficult to pass judgment or make an assessment as to what the story is going to really be like. However, the developers have gone on and on about how the characters drive the story. They're not just the players within the greater backdrop of the world of Thetis, they're essential and that's what the game is about. After all, they changed the name of the game from Dragon Age Dreadwolf to Dragon Age the Veilguard because the game is meant to be about the characters, your companions, romancing them, and whatever. And therein lies the rub. I don't think you can please everybody, and any one game will have limited dimensions, limited reach, and ability to satisfy everybody. And so it seems like Bioware has almost certainly gone down the route of, I'm going to make this game to satisfy the people who care most about romances, companions, and interpersonal relationships, as opposed to the story, and combat plays a very distant role here, if any. I could be wrong about this, we'll have to find out upon release, but I strongly suspect this is the case. And it's just very difficult to please everybody. You could argue that Baldur's Gate 3 did a pretty good job of that. There are people that mod out the combat because they hate it, they don't care about the game mechanics, they don't care about builds, they just want to romance a Astarion, for example. And that's fine, there's no right or wrong way to go about this. But in saying this, we really come to the crux of the issue. Will Dragon Age sell well or will it not? I think it will sell reasonably well, but you have to consider the average player. What does the average player care about? Because when I talk about this division between people, I'm talking about extremes. Extremes of people who are really into the game, albeit for very different reasons. The average person just wants a fun game. And a fun game to the average person is mostly about the combat, with some kind of story elements that aren't terribly mediocre. They're not going to spend hundreds of hours cultivating romances and relationships with people. They just want to have fun. They want to hack at monsters, cast spells, and have the story make some sense. And if Dragon Age the Veilguard is meant to be tailored to and cater to the demographic that appreciates the dating sim aspect the most, I'm not sure if that's going to land well with the average gamer who doesn't care very much about that stuff. People who are mostly about the character relationships and romances might look down upon those people, but those are the people who make the purchases in the majority. And so if Bioware decides to neglect that demographic, which is entirely possible based on my impressions thus far, where the combat looks cheap and minimized, and that's one of my biggest concerns, then the game won't be fun to those people, and insufficient numbers of people will buy the game. I can assure you that Dragon Age series fans are a minority of the people who buy the game. Whether they're story combat people or romance dating sim people, they are a majority of the so-called fans. Indeed, they are the only fan. Most people who buy these types of games buy it once, play it once, and never touch it again. And if it turns out it's not fun for that one run they're going to do, they're not going to even bother to buy the game. So Bioware is indeed playing a dangerous game, no pun intended, with the game they've developed, precisely because their approach has been so divisive, despite their claims to the contrary that this game is meant to be inclusive. Because it really seems, based on the information that they've revealed to us, based on the marketing, to be a game that appeals primarily to the people who like dressing their characters up, like romancing them, love the companions, but at the same time don't care about combat whatsoever, and care about the story minimally to averagely. And for people who fall into my faction, that does a Dragon Age game not make. But I'm not really the demographic that BioWare or EA should be concerned about. You have to think about the average person, the average guy who picks up the game, plays it once. Is it fun? Is it not? Maybe they'll play it one more time if it's fun. And if you neglect these other elements, in particular the combat, and to a lesser extent the story, all the people out there who care primarily about who they can sleep with in the game, and how much nudity there is, and dressing their characters up, they're going to lose out too ultimately if the game doesn't sell well. Anyway, thank you very much, as always, for tuning in. If you like my content, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel. It'd be much appreciated. And I'll check you out next time. Take care.